How do you keep a promise to a 9-year-old girl who never came home when it takes 51 years to keep it? She vanished half a block from her own front door. In under 30 minutes, 4,000 people searched anyway. The FBI tested the evidence in 2001 and came up empty. A lab tried again in 2015. Still no name. For 51 years, the answer just sat there, waiting on a piece of cloth nobody could read yet. Here's how it finally came out. January 29, 1972. 5:10 p.m. A group of Southern Tech fraternity brothers are cutting through a wooded stretch of land off Powers Ferry Road, roughly 1,000 yards south and east of Windy Hill Road, when one of them, Mike McCohan, stops walking. There are drag marks in the dirt. He follows them. 150 feet north, he finds what 16 days and 4,000 searchers had failed to find: a 9-year-old girl in the same clothes she'd been wearing when she disappeared. 2 days earlier, Marietta Police Captain Bill Elliott had stood in front of a room full of reporters and made a promise. Some evidence had been recovered near where investigators expected to find her, he said. The clues were good. It would take an awful lot of work. If it takes 20 years, Elliott told them, we'll catch him. It took 51. This is not a story about a 9-year-old girl who vanished on her way home from the laundromat. That part of the story is over in minutes. This is a story about what happens to a case, and to the people carrying it, across 5 decades of false leads, dead ends, and evidence that sat waiting for technology that didn't exist yet. Before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the beginning. Every case on this channel comes from the real file: court records, press conferences, forensic reports. Nothing here is invented. If you're new here, welcome. This one is hard. It involves a child. We're not going to describe what was done to her, only what the record confirms, and what it took investigators to confirm it. If that's not what you're here for today, that's okay. If it is, stay with us. This is Debbie Lynn Randall's story, and it deserves to be told in full. Every case on this channel takes days of digging through real court documents, real press conferences, and real archived case files before we ever write a word. We do that because these are real people, and they deserve to be remembered accurately. If you want us to keep doing that, and keep bringing cases like this one out of the file cabinet and into the light, take a second to subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, let's go back to January 13th, 1972. Marietta, Georgia, in January of 1972, was the kind of place where a family could send a 9-year-old across the street by herself and not think twice about it. Marietta Place was a small apartment community. Everybody's kids played outside. Everybody knew everybody's kids. It sat close enough to Atlanta that a handful of residents commuted in for work every morning, but far enough out that most people still knew their neighbors by name, still let their kids run the half-block to the corner store without a second thought. That kind of trust was the entire point of a place like Marietta Place. It was also, as it turned out, exactly what someone could take advantage of. There was no Amber Alert system in 1972, no cell phones to call when a child was running late. No national database for missing children, no text chain that could reach 4,000 people in an afternoon. If something happened to a 9-year-old half a block from home, the only early warning system was a mother's instinct that something was taking too long. Debbie Lynn Randall was a 3rd-grade student at Pine Forest Elementary. The missing persons flyer that would go up all over Cobb County a few weeks later described her plainly: 4 feet to 4'5", 55 pounds, dark brown shoulder-length hair, green eyes, an appendectomy scar from a surgery the previous December. An intelligent 3rd-grade student, the flyer read. What the flyer didn't say was that she was the self-declared queen of her neighborhood baseball team, that she loved her dolls, that she'd go to the Duds and Suds co-op laundromat across the street from her building and, instead of being bored waiting on the machines, she'd collect and stack the empty soap boxes like they were something worth having. Neighbors remembered a small, freckle-faced girl with a shy smile, quiet and careful with people she didn't know well, quick to laugh once she warmed up to you. That Christmas, she'd gotten a new pair of shoes, lavender, with little red and white beads stitched into them. She wore them every chance she got. Earlier that same day, a 12-year-old named Sandra Moody had walked past that same laundromat, helping a friend carry a sheet full of wash down the hill from 4th Street. She'd remember the sky as clear and blue, the kind of ordinary afternoon nobody thinks to hold on to, until it turns out to be the last one that ever felt ordinary again. January 13th, 1972, was a bright, unseasonably warm winter evening. At 5:30 p.m., Debbie Lynn sat down to dinner with her 2 older brothers. Her mother, Juanita, wasn't feeling well. Neither was her brother Melvin, a year older than Debbie and about as close to her as a sibling gets, but he wanted to keep watching The Rifleman, and so did she, until their mother asked someone to run the laundry across the street. Melvin stayed on the couch. Their stepfather, Roy Frank Hooker, offered to take Debbie Lynn instead. She put on the lavender shoes. She was handed $2 for the machines. At around 7 p.m., she and her stepfather walked out of apartment building 727 on 1st Street and crossed to the laundromat, half a block away. Frank left her there to load the machines and walked back home. The laundromat attendant would later tell police that Debbie Lynn left on her own about 30 minutes later, carrying a box of detergent. She never made it back. At 9:40 p.m., after Juanita and Frank found a spilled box of detergent lying on the ground next to a parked Volkswagen, 85 feet from the laundromat door and nowhere near her route home, Juanita called the Marietta police. Officers dusted the Volkswagen. They found small fingerprints on the door, angled downward, as if a child's hand had grabbed it and been pulled away. Debbie Lynn Randall was gone. Here is the detail that would matter more than anything else investigators uncovered for the next 51 years, and at the time, nobody knew to look at it. Living in that same apartment complex, the same handful of buildings where Debbie Lynn played, where her family lived, where the laundromat sat half a block from her front door, was a 24-year-old man with family ties to the neighborhood. He had one minor arrest on his record, alcohol-related. Nothing that would put a name in a homicide file. Nothing that would make a detective's list. Cold case investigator Ron Alter would later point out something simple about that apartment complex. Children who lived there played outside constantly, unsupervised, the way children did everywhere in 1972. If this man had driven through that complex more than once, he had seen Debbie Lynn Randall before. Probably more than once. Nobody would have thought anything of it. That was the entire problem. He wasn't a stranger passing through Marietta that night. He wasn't hiding in the woods waiting for a target. He was simply there, the way dozens of other unremarkable adults were there, in and out of a small apartment community where everyone assumed they at least recognized every face that belonged. He didn't disappear afterward either. He didn't leave town, didn't change his routine in any way that anyone close to him would later describe as suspicious. Unremarkable, unnoticed, easy to look past. That was exactly the problem. A community searching for a monster was never going to find one in a 24-year-old they'd already decided they knew. Investigators would later conclude this wasn't a stalking. It wasn't planned. It was, in the language cold case investigator Ron Alter would eventually use, a crime of opportunity. A man who likely drove by, saw a 9-year-old alone at dusk, and acted in the space of a few unwatched minutes. He was not on anyone's radar. Not that night. Not for the next 51 years. In the weeks after, investigators leaned hard toward a stranger theory, a drifter passing through, someone with no ties to the neighborhood at all. It was a reasonable assumption for anyone working the case in 1972. It was also wrong, and it would take 51 years and a piece of technology nobody in that room could have imagined to prove it. Within hours of Juanita's call, Marietta Police, Cobb County Police, and the Cobb County Sheriff's Office had all-out search efforts underway. Detectives began pulling the files of known sex offenders in the area, cross-referencing names against a list that, in 1972, existed only on paper. Captain Elliott personally consulted with Atlanta police about a similar assault and murder from late 1971, looking for a connection that didn't exist. For 16 days, they found nothing. Several days went by, according to the original police report, and the search seemed fruitless. Melvin Randall, the brother who'd stayed home sick that night instead of walking his sister to the laundromat, joined the search himself. He knocked on doors. He helped hang flyers with his sister's picture on them, over and over, block after block, all over Cobb County. He would carry the guilt of that one missed errand for the rest of his life. On January 26th, the community organized itself into something called the Concerned Citizens Committee and began planning what would become the largest search party Cobb County had ever assembled. The Cobb County Civil Defense welcomed search teams in from several parts of the state. On January 29th, through fog and rain, roughly 4,000 volunteers combed the woods around Marietta. That's the search that ended with Mike McCohan finding her body. Dr. Larry Howard of the State Crime Laboratory performed the autopsy that same evening at Kennestone Hospital. His findings, later confirmed in the official case record, Debbie Lynn had been criminally assaulted and strangled. We are not going to describe that finding beyond what the record states. The court and the medical examiner did that work. We don't need to repeat it here. Hundreds of people attended her funeral at Roswell Street Baptist Church on February 1st. Then the real failure began. Not a single dramatic mistake, but 51 years of small ones, stacking on top of each other. For decades, the only visual clue investigators had was a composite sketch, an artist's best guess, built from secondhand memory, of a man near the scene. It never led to a name. It never could have. A sketch can only be compared against a face someone already suspects, and no one suspected the right face for half a century. A man named David Theodore Drury walked into a police station in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and confessed to killing Debbie Lynn Randall. Investigators spent time and resources running down his story. It didn't hold up. It was a false confession, one of what Brody's office would later describe as hundreds of leads that consumed the case over the years and went nowhere. Every hour spent chasing a confession that wasn't real was an hour not spent looking for the man who was. The case went cold. Not abandoned, cold. Detectives Bill Hudson, Tim Buckley, Bill Elliott, and Ray Owens had, at least, done one thing right. They preserved the physical evidence recovered from the scene. A hair, a piece of flowery cloth. They had no idea what future technology might do with it. They kept it anyway. Here is what those four men could not have controlled, no matter how carefully they worked the case. In 1972, there was no national DNA database, no CODIS, no way to run a stranger's biological evidence against millions of other profiles at the touch of a button. William B. Rose had never been arrested for anything serious enough to end up in any database that existed yet, or would exist for another 30 years. Structurally, there was no version of 1970s forensic science that could have found him. The case wasn't just cold. It was, for a long time, unsolvable by any tool that existed. In October of 2001, 29 years after Debbie Lynn's murder, the FBI ran a test on that preserved hair. It was enough to rule out a number of potential suspects. It was not enough to name one. The case went cold again. 14 years passed between that inconclusive FBI test and the moment Cobb County tried again. The file changed hands again in 2015, when Cobb County's newly created cold case unit, then under District Attorney Vic Reynolds, pulled it out of storage and sent the cloth out for updated forensic analysis. The result? A partial DNA profile attributed to an unknown male. An unknown male, not a name, not a face, a profile with nowhere to go because there was still no match in any criminal database and no family tree yet built around it. By 2015, this was the third time the file had gone dark. One of the detectives who kept returning to it was Morris Nix, a lifelong Marietta resident who had retired after 28 years with the Cobb County Sheriff's Office, worked a stretch with the Kennesaw Police Department, and then came back specifically to work cold cases for the DA's office. Nix remembered the day Debbie Lynn went missing. He remembered it as a resident of the town, long before he ever worked it as an investigator. If you made a mistake, if you left something behind, he would say, "Technology is going to find you." He was right. It just took technology 51 years to catch up to him. Debbie Lynn's mother, Juanita, had by then remarried, and moved away from Marietta, carrying the case with her the way parents do, through birthdays that stopped arriving, through a life that had frozen at 9 years old. She died of leukemia in 2018, 17 years after that first inconclusive FBI test, having never learned a name. Her father, John, died in 2022. Neither of them lived to see the file closed. By the time it finally was, this case had passed through 3 generations of detectives. The men who worked it in 1972 handed it to the ones who ran the FBI test in 2001. Those handed it to Ron Alter and Morris Nix and the cold case unit that formed under Vic Reynolds in 2015. Each generation inherited the same unanswered question, and each one handed it forward with the same silent plea attached: find him. None of them got to see it answered themselves, except the last. Behind every case we bring you on this channel is real research, real court filings, real press conference footage, real archived reporting, not guesswork. If that kind of work matters to you, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps us keep doing it. And if this one is hitting you the way it's hitting us, tell us in the comments which part of Debbie Lynn's story stayed with you the most. Now, back to the case, because the break, when it finally came from a place nobody in 1972 could have imagined. By 2023, the science that had returned an unidentifiable partial profile in 2015 had moved forward again, into forensic genetic genealogy, the same category of technology that had, by then, cracked cold cases going back to the 1940s across the country. Traditional cold case science depends on comparison. A suspect's DNA has to already be sitting in a criminal database, or a living person has to be swabbed directly and checked against the sample by hand. Rose had never been arrested for anything that would land him in a DNA database, not in 1972, not in 2001, not in 2015, which meant the partial profile recovered from that piece of cloth had nothing to be compared against. Investigators stopped looking for a match and started building a family tree instead. Cobb County's cold case unit, under investigator Ron Alter, took the partial male profile recovered from that piece of cloth and began building a family tree around it, not searching for a name in a criminal database, but searching for a relative who had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to a public ancestry site. They found one, a distant family member with no idea their genetic information was about to close a 51-year-old murder case. That distant match pointed the investigation toward one name: William B. Rose, of Mableton, Georgia, 24 years old in 1972. The same minor, alcohol-related record, the same apartment complex. Rose's name had never once crossed the case file, not in 1972, not in 2001, not in 2015. There was one more problem. William B. Rose had been dead since 1974. 2 years after Debbie Lynn's murder. He had taken his own life. His family would later tell investigators he'd become increasingly paranoid in his final months, afraid of being arrested, though at the time no one connected that fear to anything at all. Whatever Rose knew about what he'd done, he carried it alone for 2 years and told no one. He went to his grave in 1974, having never once been asked a single question about Debbie Lynn Randall. With the cooperation of Rose's surviving family, who agreed to the exhumation despite what it meant for them, despite a truth they had no part in, and no warning was coming, investigators exhumed his remains. Samples were sent to Florida-based DNA Labs International for direct confirmation against the crime scene evidence. It matched. On a Monday in September of 2023, Cobb County District Attorney Flynn Brody stood at a podium in front of a photograph of Debbie Lynn Randall and announced that her murder had been solved. A second photograph stood beside hers that day: William B. Rose, the man whose name had waited 49 years to be spoken out loud in the same room as her picture. The answers provided today will not bring her back, Brody told the room, and we cannot extract justice from the perpetrator, but I know he must answer to a higher power. Her young life and bright smile, he said, had ended 51 years ago, gone too soon. The mission of his office, Brody added, was to deliver justice regardless of how much time had passed. He singled out the Marietta Police Department by name, the same detectives who had preserved a hair and a piece of cloth in 1972 without any idea what either one would someday be able to prove. 51 years of careful evidence storage was the only reason any of the rest of it was possible. Standing beside him was Lynn Randall, the older brother who, 51 years earlier, had been sick on the couch watching television while his sister crossed the street with a box of detergent and never came back. "I wish my mother was here," he said, "but I know she's in heaven now, and it's finally over." At one point, Morris Nix, the investigator who'd carried the case for years and remembered the day Debbie Lynn vanished as a resident of the town before he ever worked it as a detective, crossed the room and embraced Lynn Randall. Ron Alter, the investigator who had spent years rebuilding the family tree from a single partial profile, offered the closest thing this case would ever get to a motive. A crime of opportunity, committed by a man who happened to live close enough to see a child alone at dusk, and who was never once suspected because he had nothing in his history that would make anyone look twice. Lynn Randall, by then a grandfather of two himself, said he held no anger toward Rose's surviving family. "I know they're struggling, going through this too," he said. "It was tough for us, and I'm sure it's just as tough for them. I wish all of them well, and God bless them, and I don't have any animosity toward them." 51 years of waiting had not made him bitter. It had made him, somehow, more generous than the system that took this long to give him an answer. There was no trial. There was no sentencing. William B. Rose had been dead for 49 years by the time his name was finally spoken in connection with Debbie Lynn's murder. The only accountability this case would ever produce was a name on a piece of paper and a family finally allowed to stop wondering. Captain Bill Elliott's promise, "If it takes 20 years, we'll catch him," took 2.5 times that long, and by the time it was kept, the two people who had waited longest for it were both gone. Debbie Lynn Randall was 9 years old. She was the queen of her neighborhood baseball team. She collected soap boxes at a laundromat like they were treasure. She had a new pair of lavender shoes she loved enough to wear every day she could. She had a brother a year older than her who watched television with her most nights, who was too sick to walk her across the street that one night, and who spent 51 years believing that mattered more than it did. She had 51 years stolen from her. Not just the years she should have lived, but the years her own parents spent not knowing, and dying without ever finding out. Here's the question this case leaves behind. The evidence that finally identified her killer had been sitting in a police property room since 1972, through a 2001 test that came up short, through a 2015 test that came up nameless. The technology that solved this case in 2023 already existed for years before it was finally pointed in the right direction. How many other pieces of cloth in how many other evidence lockers are sitting right now waiting for the same thing to happen to them? Captain Bill Elliott made his promise to catch this man in 1972, and he wasn't lying. He simply had no way of knowing what he was promising against. What does justice mean 51 years after the fact, when the person responsible has been dead for 49 of them? And what about David Theodore Drury and every false confession like his? How much time do investigators lose chasing a story that was never true? Time that a real trail somewhere else is running out while they do. If you want to see more cases like this one, the ones that took decades, the ones the system almost let go cold for good, subscribe and stay with us. Every one of these stories deserves to be told all the way through, and that's what we're here to do. Rest easy. Debbie Lynn.